Hi everyone. So now that we have a little bit of background on primatology and some of the key primate characteristics, we can talk about actual primates and some of the variation that is present in them. So following a cladistic classification system, we basically have two large groups or suborders of primates, the strepsirrhines and the haplorhines. So we are part of haplorhines, along with basically the majority of monkeys and apes, and then an odd little group called the tarsiers, which we'll talk about. And then we have the strepsirrhines, the lemurs and lorises. And so the strepsirrhines are the primates that have the most ancestral traits. So they look kind of the most like, or they have still them. They still have a lot of shared characteristics with other mammals, whereas the haplorhines as a group are where we start to see a lot more of the kind of primate characteristics, so a lot more of what we call kind of classic primates. And so what we're going to focus on is the key traits or distinctions that are used between the suborders, so between strepsirrhines and haplorhines. Then we're going to look at some of the variation between the various infraorders and superfamilies that exist. And then next week, we're going to look more specifically at the hominins, which is a group from the hominoids. So we're going to look specifically at humans and human evolution. Okay, here, let's put me there. So the first group, the strepsirrhines. So we shouldn't be surprised that the majority of strepsirrhines in a contemporary context are found in what we call the Old World tropics. So basically Africa and Asia, very broadly speaking, both in tropical and subtropical environments. So the key thing that we're going to see here is adaptations to these tropical environments, specifically arboreal adaptations. And again, as I've mentioned, that they retain a lot of primitive traits, what we call primitive or ancestral traits that we don't see in the haplorhines, right? So the haplorhines have the more, what am I looking for? I'm blanking on the word, but less primitive traits or less ancestral traits that are associated with them. They're an important group for us to study in the living form because they might tell us something about that initial split that the primates made away from mammals more generally speaking. So we tend to look at them as analogs for our earliest fossil primates, which we'll look at in the next video. So this includes, using kind of more common names, the lemurs, lorises, and galagos, and here's a variety. And one of the key things we see with the strepsirrhines as a group is quite a bit of variation in terms of overall body size. So we can see everything from Andiri, which is one of the largest of the strepsirrhines, all the way down to Microcebus, the gray mouse lemur, which is a couple of inches in length. So from a couple of feet to a couple of inches, quite a bit of variation. But you see overall that compared to apes and monkeys and humans look a lot more like, again, just kind of a generic mammal. So what are some traits that we see with the strepsirrhines? So good sense of smell. So we still see that pronounced snout, although we are starting to see stereoscopic vision. And there's some anatomical markers we can look at. One is including a post-orbital bar, and I'll show you an example of this in lecture. But again, still overall a reliance on that sense of smell, right? So much smaller cranium, much smaller brain overall because they don't have the enhanced visual centers that we see in other primates with more derived. That's the word I was looking for, with more derived traits or characteristics. Part of having a good sense of smell is they have something called a rhinarium. And this is that moist nose. Basically what happens is you have that they have a connected flap of skin that goes from their mouth, and this whole area is wet and moist, and it connects all the way through to the mouth. We don't have that, right? We have this dry gap between it. Dogs and cats and other mammals, again, have this rhinarium, this moist nose, and it basically helps with, again, that sensory, that focus on olfaction. As part of this as well is that they also engage in scent marking. So they have little glands associated. So you might see lemurs at the zoo scent marking. And so this is a very common thing we see amongst the strepsirrhines. So they not only have an enhanced sense of smell relative to other primates, but they also are capable of doing scent marking. They are definitely primates, prehensile hands and feet, and the majority of them have, again, nails versus claws. Some of them have what is called like a grooming claw, which is used for grooming purposes and important not only health but social characteristic that many primates have. They have something called a tooth comb, and so this is illustrated here. Basically, all of their central incisors are really long, like the teeth on a comb, and again, this is used for grooming as well. And their teeth are a little bit different. So we have something called a dental formula, and basically it relates to the 4 different types of teeth that we have in our mouths, and it looks for the counting of the number in a quadrant. So basically what they have is 2 incisors, 1 canine, 3 premolars, and 3 molars. So this is different from a significant number of haplorhines that have a 2-1-2-3 dental formula. And you'll see that it's 2-1-3-3 over 2-1-3-3. So that's the maxillary or the upper teeth, again, in one quadrant, and the lower. But of course, we have 4 quadrants. So this means that the 2-1-3-3 pattern would repeat on the other side. Again, just want to show you some pictures, show you some of the variation that we have here. Again, a lot of the suborder of lemurs can be found on Madagascar, which is off the coast of my study area, Tanzania. Again, from the largest Indira indiri all the way down to Microcebus. Ringtail lemurs are a very familiar version. If any of you have been to our zoo here in Edmonton, you've likely seen these individuals running around in their enclosure space, but we do have a couple of other varieties as well. In terms of lorises and galagos, so you can see they're quite small. They have, you can see, quite a reduced snout, especially compared to lemurs here. And you can see binocular vision, right? They have these large eyes. And one of the things we can talk about is basically the background of these photos give you a pretty good hint in terms of the activities. So one of the key distinctions we make between various kinds of primate is whether or not they are diurnal or most active during the day. So humans tend to be largely diurnal, but a lot of these more ancestral forms of primates tend to be much more active at night. And with lorises and galagos in particular, galagos are often referred to sometimes as bush babies. They are very active at night, and it's likely due to their small size. So they have these massive eyes. And again, I'll show you a little cast of one of their craniums, their little skulls, that show you just how big their eyes are. And this allows them to take in a whole bunch of light during the night. Of course, when it's really dark and light sources are fairly limited, so they still are able to use their eyes, which are still, a little bit more derived than other mammal forms are, and their binocular vision. And the key thing with binocular vision that we need to remember is that it allows for overlapping fields of vision, which allows for the perception of depth. And this is really important when you're living in trees, because as you can imagine, as you're moving from branch to branch, you need to know how far away that next branch is when you're reaching for it. And so that's just a key consideration as well, is that it's not just for seeing in the dark, but it's having depth perception in low light or dark environments. Again, very cute little guys here. So that's all I had to say about the strepsirrhines. So the key thing, again, is a lot of these ancestral traits with the key characteristics that make them primates also present as well. Once we get into the haplorhines, also called the higher primates, we see an explosion of a variety of different types, both in body form, again, in activity levels. If they're diurnal and nocturnal, the majority of haplorhines we're going to see, we start to see a shift into diurnal. We start to see a lot wider variety in locomotion form. So one of the things we see with the strepsirrhines here, as you can see, is quadrupedal locomotion, but we also can have vertical clinging and leaping as well. We'll talk about that specifically in the case of tarsiers in a second here. Okay, so again, they share many traits that are not seen in strepsirrhines, but of course have the generic standard primate pattern that is present. Now, the reason why tarsiers are kind of separated out is that tarsiers look a lot like the other strepsirrhines. They're small bodied, they have these massive eyes. Some of them have eyes that are even bigger than their actual brain is. They move in similar patterns. But genetic analyses, looking at the fossil record, have allowed us to actually separate them out and realize that they're actually more closely related to us, so monkeys, apes, and humans, than they are to lemurs, lorises, and galagos. So they probably most correctly fit within the haplorhines. But it's one of those academic debates where the jury is still kind of out. But my understanding is, largely speaking, most humans or most researchers who study this, most primatologists agree that tarsiers should be placed within the haplorhines. So what are some of these differences? Increase in body size. We'll see this as an example. Note that when we talk about increase in body size, when we talk about it from haplorhines to strepsirhines, we mean it overall speaking. But one of the other things we have to consider with the haplorhines, and this is going to be a major trend in primate evolution, so we'll talk more about this, or I'll talk more about this in the next video, and then we'll talk about it in lecture on Friday, is that we also see a larger brain size in relation to body size, kind of culminating with us as humans. And this is kind of one thing that really markedly sets us apart from all other primates, is just how big our brain is as an organ relative to our body size. We're by and far not the largest primate, but we definitely have the largest brain. It's not only the largest brain in terms of overall volume, but it's also in terms of surface area. And again, we'll look at that more next week when we look at human evolution. An even more reduced reliance on olfaction, a much greater increase in reliance on vision, particularly a greater degree of color vision, likely related to also seeing greater activity levels during the daytime. Also a shift from an arboreal to a terrestrial environment with some of these primates as well. More generalized dentition, so we're going to see a shift in the dental formula and how the teeth are structured, right? So we're going to see a loss of that specialized dental comb, which is a grooming characteristic. We do not have rhinariums. As I mentioned, right, I have to kind of copy it or replicate it by actually flipping up my lip to have this. But of course, strepsirhines don't have to flip their lip. They already have a rhinarium. We do not have that. And then we're going to see that, then we're going to see some variations amongst the haplorhines that allow us to divide into kind of the four major groups, which is tarsiers, monkeys, apes, and then humans. And humans were part of apes, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so let's look at some of these folks. So as I mentioned, first and foremost, we have our little tarsiers. And when I say little tarsiers, indeed, I mean little. They are the smallest of the haplorhines. Look again, and I'll show you an example of a tarsier skull in class. And you can see just massive eye orbits with a total volume of their eye, each individual eye larger than their brain themselves. They have these highly specialized hands and feet, in particular the tarsal bones, which is their name derived from. That's basically the bone that represents kind of the back of your foot, the bottom of your foot, and your heel. And this allows them to engage in what's called vertical clinging and leaping. If you need a little mental health break, I highly recommend Googling tarsier jumping videos, and you can see these little guys flinging themselves throughout a forest environment, catching bugs midair, cramming them in the mouth, and then landing on a tree. And they can use these really long toes, these really long hands, in order to grasp onto branches and stay stable in these forest environments. They also have these massive feet, as you can see here, because these allow them to get that propulsion as they push away from the tree to propel themselves as they're moving throughout this arboreal environment. Okay. The next major division we have to look at amongst the suborder of haplorhines is into the two major infraorders. So again, we have tarsiers as their own little trajectory, and then we have essentially what are called New World monkeys, and then Old World monkeys, apes, and humans. And this figure here is an excellent one that characterizes some of the key things. So one of the key ways that I separate between these groups is between the plat or the plate-like rinds. Oh, so I should mention that rind, when used in language, usually refers to nose. So think rhinarium, wet nose, platyrrhine, plate-like nose, or a flat, broad nose. Whereas we have catarrhines, we have kind of what I call kind of catacomb noses, downward facing nostrils, and they're kind of cavernous, right? You have to kind of climb up into them. Again, weird imagery, but whatever works helping you remember this. So that's what's meant by kind of a broad or flat nose versus a narrow nose, right? And again, this is just signaling, again, a decreased reliance on olfaction or sense of smell, increased reliance on vision. And right, as primates go, we have the worst sense of smell. Okay. Another distinction we've seen between platyrrhines and catarrhines is the reduction in the number of premolars. So 3 premolars, ancestral form, right? We see it with our lemurs, lorises, and galagos, great apes, monkeys, Old World monkeys, and humans. We have a reduction. We have the more derived form, which is 2 premolars. Also, we lack tails. So some catarrhines have tails, but if they have a tail, so some Old World monkeys, they do not have what is called a prehensile tail. So a prehensile tail has a little fleshy pad at the end of it, which is very akin to the sensitivity of our fingertips, but it also has high mobility in it. And so essentially you can see here that they're using it to grasp, to provide stability and support as they're using quadrupedal locomotion or four-limb locomotion through their tree to forest environment. With catarrhines, we start to see a lot more without tails and a lot more that starts to spend time in our the terrestrial environments as well, so on the ground. So these are just a summary of some of these characteristics. Oh, I'll just mention this. One of the distinctions, one of the ways that we know that they might spend a lot of time sitting and on the ground is through the presence of what are called ischiocallosities, basically kind of like leathery, again, sensitive, tactile pads of skin that are located on their bottoms. Okay, and you've probably seen these ischiocallosities on baboons, for example, have them. Also, cheek pouches are also sometimes present in catarrhines that allow for the storage of food, and again, freeing of hand then to collect additional food, shove it in your mouth, or to navigate your way through a forested or on a terrestrial environment as well. So first, let's look at the platyrrhines. Again, a slightly more ancestral version of monkeys. So we refer to platyrrhines as New World primates, and this reflects their distribution, that they're found in the forested areas of southern Mexico, Central and South America. That is referred to, generally speaking, as the New World, Old World, so Africa, Asia, and Europe. Your textbook talks a little bit more about this, and it explains that, and we'll see this from an evolutionary perspective, that primates essentially have been around in the New World for a significant period of time, and their distribution today is much more limited or restricted than it was at points in the past. So what are some common traits of these New World primates? Diurnal, again, active during the day, have that flat nose, flat face. Overall, smaller bodied compared to what we see with Old World primates in general. They fall into two major groups, the callitrichids and the cebids. This is where the distinction is not as critical. So I want you to focus on kind of the macro level understandings of how they're divided. So the difference between platyrrhines and catarrhines, and then actually variation within the catarrhines is going to be really critical. But it's just important to note that there are two major groupings of platyrrhines. So we have the callitrichids, marmosets and tamarins, and then the cebids. Essentially the difference between the two here is that, as it mentions, callitrichids have claws, they don't have nails, much more primitive form or ancestral form. They're also considered to be largely monogamous, and this is likely a function of them commonly birthing twins. Cebids, on the other hand, have a much larger body size, and they're more readily identified as such, and then have varying forms of social organization as well. So here's what some of these callitrichids look at. I have to note at this time that, for example, some of these callitrichids, such as this golden tamarind here, is at risk. It's an endangered animal, and it's likely because of its beautiful fur. So they've been hunted and harvested in the past because of just the beauty of their fur here. Or their hair, I should say, more properly speaking. Here's some variation of various forms of cebids, including some portraits from a lovely book I have called Primate Portraits. This is Katie. You may recognize Katie. She very famously was on the widely popular television show Friends. This is Ross's monkey Marcel, so she's a famous actress. So very famous capuchin. And then here I'm just illustrating some of the characteristics of the cebids here, right? So here's that hairless patch of skin, very fingertip-like at the base of the tail, or not the base, at the tip of the tail here. Another thing to note is that for some of them, their thumb is greatly reduced, and this is likely to them being in an arboreal environment, but their feet have a lot of prehensile-ness that allows them for this mobility here. And here's a good old howler monkey, basically signaling his success in terms of reproductive success. One of the things you'll note is that's common in monkeys, both Old World and New World monkeys, is sexual dimorphism that can be either represented in differences in body size, or as shown here in the fur or in their hair color, in the differences in the coat. Okay, so now on to the catarrhines. So platyrrhines, New World primates, catarrhine, Old World primates. All platyrrhines are monkeys. Catarrhines, now we see some distinctions, right? That they're not all monkeys. Indeed, we have a couple of groups of monkeys, the cercopithecids, the colubids. Hylobatids, or gibbons, are referred to as lesser apes. We have the pongidae, the great apes, orangutans, chimpanzees, and gorillas, and of course ourselves, Homo sapiens, or the hominins. Okay, so first let's look at old world monkeys. So these are the ones that have the cheek pouches, again, to store that extra food, the ischial callosities or their sitting pads, wide distribution across parts of Africa and Asia, wide variety of broad adaptations to a number of different environments. And again, excepting us, and members of our genus, they have the most extensive adaptation. This is a highly successful group of primates. One of the key things to see here is that their social organization varies. Many do exist in what we call multi-male, multi-female societies and groups. So dominance hierarchies play a key role in navigating and negotiating access to resources, supporting kin, everything else that's going on in social organization. And some actually demonstrate extreme sexual dimorphism. So there's very marked differences between males and females of these various species. Here's some differences. I was so excited when I captured this picture. So this is an example of a baboon in my study area in Tanzania. And what you can see with this baboon here is this is a baboon mother, and this is her baby riding what we call jockey style. And so this is kind of a specific trait that we see with them. And basically this is an adaptation that allows the baby to use its, the juvenile to use its grasping hands to cling onto its mother. And basically when it's large enough, it moves from the mother's chest where it clings into the fur onto its back where it can ride, and then it can hop down, examine what the mother is doing in terms of foraging for food resources, and then climb back onto her back as they're moving with the group to keep up with it. Lots of variety in their coats. You can see here some have beautiful eyebrows and facial hair, lots of different kinds of color. This is showing a little bit of sexual dimorphism here, a larger male with a smaller female. Baboons also exhibit sexual dimorphism. Of course, mandrill baboons have these beautiful faces that are used for signaling so much information to group members. The latest David Attenborough special actually talks about this, about the use of color in primate coats in particular to signal things like reproductive receptivity, coming of age for females undergoing estrus. So we will see swelling of the genitals, signaling availability for reproduction and ability to basically fertility, while males on the other hand are signaling dominance, growth, strength, and preferable genetics in terms of transmission to offspring. But you can see the males are significantly larger than the female, and that's what the female's doing here, is essentially presenting her genitals to a potential mate. Here's some of those little macaques. These are little snow monkeys here, and you can see that they're huddling here for grooming and for support. The other group of old world monkeys is the colubids, and they're often referred to leaf-eating monkeys. And that's because as a group, they're set apart from the other old world monkeys in that they have sacculated or chambered stomachs very similar to other animals that eat, and mammals, including things like cows and deer and whatnot, that eat predominantly leaves in their diet. Again, you can see quite a bit of variation, but a much larger body form than what we've seen in other primates. Again, distributed throughout Africa and Asia. Because they eat leaves, they spend a lot of time in the trees. They are arboreal and they're leapers. And here's one of those earlier course terms. Often they live in single male, multi-female groups. We have some interesting variations here in terms of group form amongst primates, but the colubids overall as a group are most commonly polygynous in their organization. Then we get to the Hylobatidae. These are the lesser apes, including gibbons here, and they're really famous because of their brachiation, right? They have these really long four-limbed hind limb ratios that allows them to swing with ease through the trees. And I'll show you an example of a hylobatid torso and their limbs, so you can just see how long their arms are. They tend to live in small monogamous groups, and they have a fairly limited range occurring in Southeast Asia. Again, so it's likely because they have this limited territory, and as such are extremely territorial because of their highly specialized form of locomotion. Apologize in the background, you can hear my cat screaming at me. Okay, the last group we need to look at is the superfamily of Hominoideae, so hominoids. And so this includes the great apes and us, our humans. What sets us apart from everyone else? Really large body size. This is where we see that reduction in the dental formula. So we have, again, the more derived form of only having 2 premolars versus 3. We don't have tails. While we have a large body size, we have a fairly short trunk. You'll see some of the other ones, or the images I've shown you, they have very long trunks, and it's because they're quadrupeds. They're using all 4 of their limbs in locomotion. Their arms, with exception of us, are longer than their legs. Their limb proportions vary, and this again relates to the specialized forms of locomotion they use. Like the lesser apes, we're capable of using brachiation, or arm-over-arm swinging. Chimpanzees and gorillas use a form of knuckle walking, and then humans, as we'll talk about next week, have a very unique form of locomotion, which is bipedalism. In order to facilitate brachiation, we have some shoulder modifications. We can talk more about these, and I'll illustrate these in lecture. More complex behavior, we can talk about what that means when we talk about behavior and tool use and culture in hominins next week. Also complex brain. All of this, however, means that we tend to be born fairly prematurely, which means that there is, again, this increase or greater reliance our parental investment on infant care as we age. When it comes to understanding the great apes, we have much to thank from these 3 incredible women referred to as the Primates, or Leakey's angels, Dr. Goodall, Fossey, and Galdicus. Dr. Fossey is not with us anymore. Her advocacy for the rights of the mountain gorillas in Rwanda led her to, unfortunately, being murdered, which has still gone solved to this day, but she brought to the world's attention just how endangered the mountain gorillas are, and urged and encouraged for their conservation, as has Goodall and Galdicus through these years. Galdicus is probably Dr. Brute Galdicus is probably the least known. She's one of Canada's own. She's located at the Simon Fraser University, and she studies orangutans, whereas Dr. Goodall, of course, Dr. Jane Goodall, is most famous for her work of chimpanzees. But all of these women revolutionized our understanding of great ape behavior, really not only brought attention to the fact that they are at risk, but also drew our attention to just how incredible these particular species are. So again, really important figures, and we can talk a little bit more about their contributions to how primatology was done as well in lecture this week when we talk about them. So great apes are probably the primates that you're most familiar with, and usually the sticking point that I usually make with students is just remember that these distinctions between monkey and ape and lesser ape and human, and between strepsirrhines and haplorhines and catarrhines and platyrrhines are all meaningful, right? Again, what they reflect is the various adaptations that these primates have to their environments, and they reflect their evolutionary histories as well, which we'll look at more in the next topic. So just to summarize that, what we see with the ponghids is, anatomy for brachiation, but using all varieties of locomotions to get around in their environments, and that's what makes them really successful, right? Spending time both in arboreal and terrestrial environments. And then we see some differences in terms of their social organization. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more on the board when I can show what these different kinds of social organization and territory ranges look like in practice. So just some pictures to refresh. Again, our orangutan, our gorillas, and here is one of the species of chimpanzees using a termite stick, so tool use. So remembering that that's one of the critical things that sets primates apart from other animals. And we'll talk about some of the distinctions between the different types of chimpanzees and how we came to actually understand them a little bit more in lecture this week on Wednesday, sorry. And then that will lead us with humans, which we'll talk a lot about next week. How did we get to be who we are is a product of, again, our evolutionary history and the variety of species that are our ancestors leading to us. So take care, everyone, and we will see you in the next lecture when we talk about primate evolution.